Hey guys, it's Becky with Design Bundles, and I am super excited to come here and join you today and talk to you about troubleshooting on your Cameo cutting machine. Now, most of these tips will transfer whether you're using a Cameo 4, a Cameo 3, even some tips for the older models, okay? And I won't say that these will get you cutting in no time, because if you're here, chances are you are pretty frustrated and you're looking for answers. But I will say that these are our top tips and tricks to hopefully get you on the right road and successfully cutting your projects. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay guys, so let's talk about our three categories. I break troubleshooting down into these three categories. You have your blade, you have your software, and you have your settings. And I know what you're thinking, isn't the software and the settings the same thing? Surprisingly no, okay, which is exciting because it gives us more avenues to explore. But I will honestly say I feel like 9 times out of 10, it starts with your blade. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Now your blade, the very first thing that I'm going to suggest, and this is very important for Cameo 3 and Cameo 4. When you guys get your machines, you are given an auto blade. And I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer. I will let you know there are a lot of people who use the auto blade and they don't have any problems at all, okay? But I will say that I personally, being the old school crafter that I am, switched back to using a ratchet blade. Now the ratchet blades are also cheaper, so that helps my crafting budget, but I primarily switched back because I did have quite a few problems using the auto blade. I heard things from it's a bad batch to, we'll send replacements and yada, yada, yada. I just felt like it was easier to go back to the ratchet blade. Now, you may not agree with me because that's one of the big benefits of your Cameo, especially the 3 and the 4, because you get the auto blade so you don't have to adjust it yourself. But I just feel like I get more reliable cutting using a ratchet blade. So keep that in mind. Now that's not my only tip for blades, okay? Let's talk about making sure that your blade is installed correctly. All right, now I know it seems like it should be easy. You just pull out your little plug, plop the blade in there, plug it back in, get to cutting. But especially with the auto blade, it's very important that your blade is fully seated in the blade housing, because if it's not down all the way and there's even the slightest bit of a gap, then whenever it goes to change, when it goes to adjust, those adjustments aren't happening or they're not happening correctly. Okay, so you absolutely have to make sure that the blade is all the way down. Let's also talk about, especially when you're cutting thicker materials. I have this in particular when I cut a lot of faux leather. The blade has a white cap on the tip of it, and that white cap can be unscrewed, and which is good because it means that you can clean it, but it's bad because it means sometimes it will come unscrewed from using the thicker materials, and you won't necessarily notice it, but even just unscrewing the slightest bit can stop either the blade from adjusting or it can stop the blade from cutting through your material. So always check there. And while you're checking that out, go ahead and make sure that you do not have a dirty blade. Okay. Now what I mean by that, not that it, has, bits of dirt, literally. I call it a dirty blade, but it's debris, okay? Especially when you're cutting cardstock or small pieces of vinyl. Sometimes little debris can get caught either on the end of the blade or on the inside of the blade, and it can keep your blade from working properly. So if you're checking the cap, go ahead and unscrew it all the way and make sure that your blade is nice and clean. The final thing I feel like to check your blade for is make sure that you have not chipped the end of it. You can actually break off the tip if you're cutting too deep or trying to cut super thick materials. And then also keep in mind that it may just be time for a new blade. Okay, that does happen. And it doesn't seem to happen I won't say, obviously it happens gradually, but it will literally, for me at least, it seems like cut fine, cut fine, cut fine, trash, trash, trash. Whereas I would expect to see a progression. But usually about my third or fourth bad cut, I'm like, Becky, when is the last time you replaced your blade? And I'll switch out my blade, and a lot of times that's the answer I'm looking for. So just keep in mind that that is a possibility. Now, let's talk about your software. We are going to talk about your page setup panel. Okay, we're going to talk about making sure that your cut lines are accurate and turned on. We will talk about maybe you need to trace your image. And then we'll also talk about your Bluetooth connectivity. So I'm actually going to take you over into the software so that you can check those out.
Okay, so in Silhouette Studio, I always recommend everybody to start at the page setup panel. That is going to be your icon up here on the top right. You can see my mouse moving over here. You can also go to panels, and it will be the very first panel right there listed on your menu, okay? Now, what I want to stress about this is that you want to set this up to directly reflect what you are cutting. So that means you need to make sure you select the correct machine. Make sure that you select the correct cutting mat. Because if there's going to be a big difference between a Cameo cutting mat and cutting without a mat, depending on how far it loads the material or mat into the Cameo whenever you're getting ready to cut. Same thing goes for the portrait, okay? And then your media size. Now, typically speaking, as long as you're cutting a 12 by 12 sheet, you can just leave it on 12 by 12 and you're fine. But let's say you are actually using a scrap and it's only 6 by 6. You can come here to custom and you can type in the dimensions that you want. And then let's take a look at how that looks there. Isn't that much different than the 12 by 12? Okay, now that's also important because you can come down here and turn on both your print border and your cut border. Now the print border would be, for example, if you are wanting to use a print and cut. We're not going to get into that right now, but mainly your cut border is very important. And let me also show you a little bit on why it's important to have the correct mat, because let's leave that on Cameo for a minute and let's change that back to a 12 by 12. And this thin red line is my cut border, right? So what happens when I switch the mat to none? Do you see how I lost a little bit of cut area along the sides? And I lost almost an inch, if not a whole inch, at the bottom. Okay, and that's because your rollers need to hold on to that part of the material. So that's why it's important to check this page setup panel, because it's going to give you a lot of really good options to kind of set you up for success. So whatever you are cutting on your machine, you need to make sure that that is what is reflected right here when you're looking at your page setup panel. Okay, so now let's talk about what happens if your cut lines are not turned on. So this is an SVG, okay? It looks like it should be perfectly good and ready to cut. When I click over to my send panel, you see I don't have any red cut lines. And sometimes that'll happen. It used to happen particularly with SVG files, but no need to panic, no need to trace. All I'm going to do is come over here and click cut. Okay, now what that's going to do is it's going to activate those cut lines, and now everywhere that I see a dark red line, that is where it's going to cut. Now let's talk about when I bring in an image. Okay, this is an image, and if I click over to cut, you will see I get a square. And I see that question a lot. Hey, I don't know what I'm doing wrong, but my machine is only cutting squares. Well, if you come to your send panel and you see that it's a square, it's because it's picking up the outline of your design. Okay, so what that means is that we have to trace this design first. Now, I specifically chose one that was black and white to make this super easy, but we do have a video on tracing in our playlist if you want to check it out. But basically, I just need to trace that. Then I can delete the image. I actually don't even need the image anymore. And now when I click over to send, there are my cut lines, okay? Last but not least, let's talk about your Bluetooth. Now you can see down here in the bottom of my screen, it says my Cameo 4 is unavailable. Now I'll say this, I do not have connectivity problems with my Cameo 4, but I did with my Cameo 3. And I troubleshooted a lot and I just wasn't able to get it worked out. But I wasn't alone in that. So if you're tuning in and you have a Cameo 3, just know that that may be a pre-existing issue, okay? But once I turn on my Cameo and I activate the Bluetooth, I am able to come down here and in just a moment it should update and show you that my machine is connecting and then ultimately ready. Now, if you are having problems getting your machine to connect, then what you can do is your machine did come with a USB cable. And let me show you how you switch over to that. You're going to take the USB cable, plug it into your machine, and then also plug it into your computer. Now, when I do that, you'll notice I now have two machines down here. And you'll see each one has an icon. So my Cameo 4 Bluetooth, it is ready. It did catch up with us. And then this symbol right here indicates that this is my Cameo 4 USB connection. So as of right now, I could choose either one of those. But the cable is good to have because then if I need to fall back on using that cable because the Bluetooth won't connect, or sometimes if you go, maybe you're at a friend's house or you're at a crafting class or whatever, and a lot of you guys are using Bluetooth, they can interfere with each other, or you can accidentally connect Bluetooth to somebody else's machine, and I've totally had that happen. So sometimes having that USB cable is a good fallback for when you're experiencing those types of problems. Now, if you keep going and you can't get your Bluetooth to connect, then that is when it would be a good time to reach out to the Silhouette America support, and hopefully they should be able to help you with that. I would love to tell you that I have all the answers to your Bluetooth questions, but unfortunately, just depending on all the different software versions and all the different computers and that sort of thing, but Silhouette America is going to have the technical expertise to really walk you through how to successfully troubleshoot your Bluetooth connection.
Last but not least, let's go ahead and talk about our settings. So by settings, we're going to talk about test cuts, how to do a test cut, and how to adjust your test cut. Okay. We're also going to talk about the presets that are available in the Silhouette Studio software. We will talk about how to make adjustments to the settings within the software and situations when you would or would not want to do that. We're also going to talk about what happens when you cut your material too deep, and then also what happens when you do not cut deep enough. There's also a couple settings that we're going to go over, which is doing you'll often hear it referred to as a double cut, but now with the recent upgrades to Silhouette Studio, they refer to it to doing a number of passes. You can choose the number of passes. And there's also a feature called line segment overcut that is really worth exploring. And last but not least, we are going to talk about whether a design is too thin or too small and how you can thicken up those designs if you're not getting a very good cut, okay? Because the problem is if you have designs that have really small details or really small fonts, the machine is just not equipped to handle those fonts. The blade just does not do well when you have lines that are close together because it loosens up your material either from the cutting mat or it loosens it up from the back of your vinyl, and you can get stray pieces and just lots of things could go wrong. So we'll talk about how to make those thicker and what to keep an eye out for. So let's go ahead and go back to the software.
Okay, so we are back in Silhouette Studio, and the first thing I told you we were going to talk about is your test cut down here at the bottom right-hand corner, okay? And of course you can select which tool. Now most of you, well, I don't want to say that. I very, very rarely use Tool 2. So usually just leave it right here on Tool 1. That way you are doing a test cut on the correct tool that you're cutting with, okay? But just letting you know that's what the 1 and 2 are for. Now, when you hit a test cut, it is going to give you a little cut that is a square with a triangle on the inside. And the whole idea behind a test cut is being able to weed out the inside of that square but leave the triangle intact. And if that is not the result that you get when you weed, then that means that you need to adjust your cut settings. Now, typically speaking, let's go ahead and talk about presets. You have a whole slew of materials here to choose from. And a lot of these are preset for Silhouette brand products, but for the most part, they are going to work for what you're using. For example, there is a vinyl glossy, there's a vinyl matte, there is cardstock, there is heat transfer vinyl smooth. Now, let me give you this little tip. Even for heat transfer vinyl glitter, I still cut on heat transfer vinyl flocked. I actually feel like I get better cuts on the flocked, but don't be afraid to test both of them out. See what works well for you. You have bonded fabric, you have copy paper and chipboard, and I always start at whatever the preset is, and then I make adjustments as needed. So I'll put in the preset, do a test cut, see how I feel about it, okay? So for this, I'm just going to assume, hey, I'm going to cut this out of vinyl. So I'm going to scroll down and I will choose vinyl glossy. And I will do a test cut because Silhouette Studio has decided that these cut settings are ideal for glossy vinyl. Now, let's say that your test cut was not successful. All right, what that means is that you have either cut too deep or you have cut too shallow. Okay, if you have cut too shallow, which is most common, what that means is that when you attempted to weed your square, it did not separate from the rest of the vinyl. Okay, so what you're going to do is leave your vinyl on your mat, reload your mat into your machine, and then you can use these arrows down here on the bottom right, and if you hold down your cursor over and press down your mouse button, you will see it will move the blade housing of the machine that you're cutting with. So what that means is that you can move the area that you are test cutting, so that way when you perform a subsequent test cut, you're not test cutting on top of an area that has already been tested on. You see where I'm going with that? I actually used to just rotate my vinyl and I would cut in a different corner until I eventually ran out of corners. But this way is much easier and you get more tries. So what that means is that you can make all the adjustments you want and keep repositioning the location of your test cut until you get a successful cut. Now, I also mentioned cutting too deep. On your test cut, you do not usually recognize that you have cut too deep. The only way to know for sure is to peel that edge of the vinyl away from the mat. Because if you have cut too deep, then a lot of times that means that you have cut through the backing of your vinyl or heat transfer vinyl. Okay, and that's not your ultimate goal for those types of material. Now, the good news is if you just cut too deep on cardstock, you'll notice small things like maybe your cut won't be very crisp or some of your corners aren't very sharp. Okay, but when you're talking about vinyl, you really need to keep that backing intact. Also, adhesive vinyl, if you cut it just a little bit too deep, and this isn't like a make or break, but what will happen is you will have problems peeling it up from the backing. All right, you will peel your vinyl up and you will flip it over and look on the back of your vinyl and you will see that you still have some paper attached. Now, don't wig out because you could take some tweezers or your weeding tool and you can get that paper off and your decal is still usable. But if you're having a hard time getting your vinyl decal to transfer, and I bring this up because a lot of beginners start with vinyl decals and it's a really good place to start. And if you have a hard time getting it to pick up on your transfer tape, then either you have the wrong kind of transfer tape or you've just simply cut your design too deep. So let's talk about adjustments. Okay, say I cut this and I realize, hey, my test cut wasn't very good. I need to make some adjustments and cut again. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to increase my force. Okay, now your force is the amount of downward power that your machine is exerting. All right, and your force you can adjust in smaller increments than you can the blade. So if I'm not getting a good cut and I am ready to do another test cut, I will simply come over here and I will change my force. I increase by intervals of 5. So I'll go from 10 to 15. Now this maxes out at 33, and you can choose anywhere in between there, okay? If you're cutting a thicker material like faux leather or chipboard, then you're going to want to increase your passes, because sometimes even with the correct settings you need those passes, because it's almost like it's cutting in layers. So your first pass will cut the top layer, your second pass will come back through and finish the job. Now, at what point do you want to adjust the blade? I adjust the blade when my force increase isn't enough. So if I have this setting and I get all the way up to a force of 33 and my test cuts still are not successful, I will bring my force back down to the original, which you can do really easy because you can revert back. Watch, when I go up to a larger force, see, I can choose revert and it will take it back to that default setting. So hit revert and then come over here. This is where you will increase your blade right here, that little dial, if you're cutting with an auto blade. If you're cutting with a ratchet blade, you will adjust it by hand. Okay, so start with your force, then come back and increase your blade. So last but not least, another setting that you need to know about here is going to be this little triangle icon. If you check that box, that is called line segment overcut. Okay, and I don't know how well you can see the icon, but basically what that does is it will pick up your blade, take it just past the point where you're going to cut, and start a new line. So instead of a corner, you have an intersection of 2 lines. And this is really, really helpful when you're cutting paper and cardstock, because a lot of times you'll get those little dog ears from cutting corners on cardstock. And this is 9 times out of 10, this will fix the problem that you're having with that. But it also helps for small designs, and some people just turn it on and leave it on. 9 times out of 10, it's not going to hurt anything. The only time I can see it being a problem is if I'm trying to cut some sort of stencil, because then those little lines will actually be cut into the part that I'm keeping. But we won't get into all that, but just know that line segment overcut is something you want to look into if you're having a lot of problems cutting cardstock, or you want to start tweaking your settings for cutting small items. All right, so speaking of small items, let's go back to design, because the key to cutting thin fonts is by thickening them up a little bit. What that means is if I have a font, let's make this really small. Okay, say I just wanted to cut this and put it on, I don't know, expanding phone grip or a keychain. All right, that design is actually a little too small and too detailed, and I would fully expect that I would lose some of those details as I'm cutting. Now, I think I already said this in the beginning, that you can slow down your speed when you're cutting thin or small designs. That does help. Okay, it also helps to have a newish blade. All right, so if you have a dull blade, do not try to cut anything with small detail, because that's just going to be all bad for you. But what you can do is you can also do a small offset. Okay, now your offset is not usually referred to in this manner, but I can take my distance all the way down, and then I can increase using the dial over here, and it will increase by 0.01. Okay, so I can hit apply. Of course, I'm going to want to group these together. And now if I look at my original and my offset, you will see a lot of these details are thicker. Now, you do lose some of the detail in the text, and that's disappointing. Okay, so you would want to do maybe a little bit of a smaller offset, but see how much thicker these lines are, and your hearts and your little star symbols here. Okay, so that is a really good alternative to at least explore. See, hey, am I able to do a small offset? And will that give me a better cut? So if I do 0.005 and group together, There we go. It thickens it up, but not to the point where you start losing the shape of your text. So hopefully you can see each of these. So this was our original, this was 0.005, this was 0.01, okay? And each one just got a little bit thicker. So what that does is it'll thicken it up so that you don't have as much problem whenever it's time to cut.
So guys, what do you think? Now I know that that is a lot of information, and I tried to go over it with you as succinct as possible, okay? Because, you know, I know you guys are on the other side of this video and you're taking notes and you're pausing the video because you know that one of these settings has to work for you, and hopefully it does. Now, don't forget, if these settings don't work, you can still post questions in the comments below, and I will do my very, very best to help you, okay? And make sure you subscribe to the channel because, you know, sometimes all it takes is some practice, and not only do we have a lot of great videos for you that we've already put out, but we always have a lot of great videos coming around the corner for you. So I appreciate you stopping by today. I wish you the best of luck in your future projects and getting your machine back on track. And, you know, we'll see you next time.